turn on notifications and never miss the beginning of a new story again. Join us and be part of every chapter. The Valley of Adamar was, in the dawn of time, a green whisper of the lost Eden, a refuge of fertile soil where the memory of perfect harmony still echoed in the gentle winds. There, among rivers of crystal-clear water and opulent orchards, the first generations of men thrived, living under the shadow of sacred traditions, legacies of reverence and labor passed down by the weary lips of the first parents. But even in the seedbed of humanity, where purity should reign, the shadow of imbalance and perverse choice began to spread. The trial did not come from outside, from beasts or droughts, but from the core of a heart that, though it worked the land with the strength of giants, could not cultivate peace in its own soul. The story of Iran, the firstborn, and Leor, the youngest, would not only be a chronicle of fratricide, but the dark landmark of the birth of injustice and spiritual solitude in the nascent world. Iran, the strong one, the master of furrows and harvests, saw in his sweat the only measure of his worth before men and, more crucially, before the Creator. His pride was an armor of cold metal, forged in ceaseless effort and the tireless pursuit of recognition that never seemed fully attainable. His spirit, though vigorous in work, was narrow and incapable of admitting goodness that did not come from muscle and visible achievement. On the other hand, Leor, the shepherd with a calm countenance and gentle hands, moved through the valley as a reflection of pure faith. He did not seek the ephemeral glory of human eyes. His soul yearned for the simple approval of the eternal, manifested in the quietness of his devotion and the purity of his purpose in guiding the flock. The Creator, in his omniscience, observed the disparity of intentions, not of works, preparing the scales of judgment that would precipitate the impending drama. The moment of the offering was the culmination of faith in the Valley of Adamar, the solemn instant when the fruit of labor and spirit was elevated. Iran, with the silent arrogance of the master of the land, deposited the finest grains, the most robust fruits of his harvest, hoping that the magnitude of his labor would force acceptance. His eyes sought the rising smoke, the irrefutable sign that his value was unquestionable. Leor, however, offered with the simplicity of an unarmed heart, surrendering the firstborn of his flock, not as payment, but as an act of total and selfless giving. The Eternal, who searches the depths of the soul and judges the substance, not the shell, accepted Leor's gift and rejected Iran's. There was no capricious favoritism, but the cold manifestation of justice. The Creator does not bend to proud effort, but to genuine humility, and the smoke of acceptance that rose from Leor's altar was, for Iran, a slow and corrosive poison. That day, Iran not only had his offering refused, he felt his own identity crumble, the foundation of his pride cracked by the undeniable evidence that his strength and effort were insufficient. The spirit of injustice previously latent awakened in his chest, a cold serpent whispering lies about divine favor. The valley, once his stage of triumph, became the scene of his humiliation. Envy, that cancer of the soul, began its silent metastasis, transforming brotherly love into deadly rivalry. Malice did not strike like lightning, but as a gradual erosion of conscience, convincing Iran that Leor was an enemy, a living obstacle to his own redemption and the recognition he so longed for. He began to see in every calm smile of his brother a mockery, and in every blessing received by Leor a theft of his own destiny. The stage was set for tragedy, and the omniscient narrator of the heavens watched the petrified heart of the firstborn. The warnings of the spirit came in unsettling dreams and whispers of the breeze, voices that spoke to him of the need to overcome the resentment that fermented in his belly. The Creator, in his infinite patience, sent clear signs confronting Iran's soul with the naked truth of his wrong motivation. If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. The firstborn heard, but did not absorb the wisdom. His wounded pride was an impenetrable shield against transforming grace. He preferred to feed the dragon of doubt and self-pity, ignoring the call to obedience and rectification. In the solitude of the fields, he plowed with blind fury. He unfolded the narrative of his own victimization, convincing himself that the fault lay not in his intention, but in the unjust predilection the Creator seemed to have for his serene brother. The contrast between the brothers deepened like an abyss. Leor, never suspecting the growing darkness in Iran's heart, continued to walk in the innocence of his devotion, tending his flock and finding satisfaction in simple existence under divine approval. His joy was disarming and pure, but to the eye consumed by envy, that same joy seemed an insolent insult, a constant reminder of the rejection Iran could not tolerate. Conversations between them became superficial, woven from half-truths and heavy silences. Iran avoided him, but the image of his brother, enveloped in the light of grace haunted him day and night, making working the land a penance and rest a torture. His countenance hardened, and the other clans began to notice the shadow that hung over the son of royal blood. The fateful day arrived under a relentless sun, with the Adamar Valley immersed in a deceptive calm, the calm that precedes the storm in the human soul. Lior, with the naivete of one who knows no evil, invited his brother for a walk. "Come, Aaron, let's go to the secluded plain where we used to play as children, so we can talk like before." In his heart, Lior felt the weight of estrangement, and in his purity, longed for reconciliation, for the lightness of restored brotherhood. Aaron accepted, but in his step there was no longer the desire for healing, but rather the cold determination of a personal judgment. His brother's invitation was transformed into opportunity, innocence into condemnation. The plain, that sanctuary of childhood memories, would be profaned by the first conscious act of violence of the new humanity, a stage of witness for eternity. They walked in heavy silence, the midday sun witnessing the journey that would lead to the loss of innocence. On the plain, the conversation was brief, a tenuous pretext for what was about to happen. Iran, facing Lior, saw not his blood brother, but the personification of his own failure and the source of his pain. The inner voice of anger and resentment, nurtured for so long, screamed louder than reason and the memory of the sacred traditions. In that instant of imbalance and cold fury, the firstborn acted with the sudden and brutal violence of one who wishes to extirpate not only a life, but an invisible obstacle to his own destiny. Lior's blood irrigated the virgin earth, and the silenced cry of the victim marked the moment when human history changed forever, inaugurating the era of stain and mourning. The murderer remained there, enveloped in the shock of his own act, in the absolute solitude that only consummated sin can impose, the curse and the mark. The silence that followed the heinous act was more deafening than any outcry. Aaron was paralyzed, staring at the land he himself had defiled. The soil that once nourished life now drank the blood of his own brother. The shock was not one of immediate moral remorse, but of the chilling realization of irreversibility. The bridge of innocence was burned, and the valley of Adamar would never again be the naive refuge it once was. Guilt, a weight hitherto unknown to humanity, settled in his soul, a spiritual parasite that stole the warmth of life and the clarity of thought. He was alone, not only because Lior lay inert, but because the very presence that sustained him seemed to have momentarily withdrawn, leaving him to the empty echo of his own perverse choice. What remained was primal fear, the desperate urge to hide the horror. The fury had subsided, leaving in its wake the vacuum of a justification that proved unfounded. Iran, in his tormented mind, perceived the magnitude of the deception. Lior's death had not redeemed him. It had not brought him divine favor. It had only irrevocably distanced him from all light. His brother's body, once an obstacle, was now the silent witness to his malice, the irrefutable proof that evil had been born in the human heart. The murderer tried with trembling hands to cover the blood, to bury the evidence, but the earth seemed to refuse to absorb the crime, keeping the red stain visible to the sky. Evil, a force hitherto abstract, had materialized into a concrete act, and Iran's conscience became the first hell of the human race, an unprecedented ordeal of guilt and despair. The Creator, whose omnipresence never abandons his creation, burst into Iran's consciousness not with thunderclaps of destruction, but with the voice of questioning, the sound of unwavering justice. The question echoed through the heavens and the soul of the firstborn. "Where is Lior, your brother?" It was not a search for information, for the Eternal One knew the horror consummated, but a final invitation to acknowledge guilt, a call to humility. The opportunity for redemption through truth was, however, rejected by remaining pride. Iran, in an act of despair and cynicism, responded with the blindest of defenses. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" In that reply, Iran's arrogance reached its peak, defying omniscience itself and sealing his fate as an exile, transforming the ordeal into an irrevocable judgment. The Eternal One then pronounced the verdict, the manifestation of justice that does not destroy, but isolates evil to protect the nascent. The voice resounded with the solemnity of an eternal decree. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Blood, life, cried out for reparation, and the earth, now cursed for Iran, testified against him. The cultivator would be rejected by the very soil that sustained him. The earth would no longer give him its strength, and he would become a fugitive, a wanderer on the face of the earth, condemned to bear the weight of his choice. It was justice that preserved life, but imposed the irreducible consequence of sin, the loss of home, the abandonment of peace, the eternal pilgrimage of guilt. Iran's world, once solid and predictable, had crumbled into into dust and exile. The punishment imposed was not merely physical, the prohibition against harvesting from the fertile soil of Adamar, but a spiritual condemnation of immeasurable depth, alienation from himself and from the community. Iran felt the weight of the curse, a burden that seemed greater than he could bear, and his lament was not that of a repentant man but of a complainer. "My punishment is greater than I can bear." He did not mourn the loss of his brother, but the loss of his own status and comfort. The firstborn, the strongest among men, found himself reduced to a wanderer, an outcast, fearing that anyone who found him might kill him in revenge. The solitude he imposed on Lior became his own prison, a bitter echo of his act of destruction, where the apparent abandonment by the Creator was, in truth, his self-exclusion from manifest grace. In that moment of despair and fear of retaliation, the Eternal, in an act that underscored the complexity of his justice and inherent mercy, intervened one last time, not to revoke the exile, but to ensure the survival of the sinner and the human legacy. Whoever kills Iran, vengeance will fall upon him sevenfold. And so that no one would make the mistake of erasing the living proof of injustice, the Creator placed a mark upon Iran. This mark, visible and indelible, was not a symbol of honor, but an emblem of warning and eternal memory, forcing the murderer to carry the testimony of his guilt on his own body, a constant reminder of the choice that fractured the primordial harmony. Iran, marked, became a walking chronicle of nascent evil, a monument to the vengeance of envy. News of the tragedy spread through the Adamar Valley like a cold, corrosive fog. The clan, once united by the simplicity of the sacred traditions, was shaken by loss and incomprehension. How could evil, senseless violence have sprouted in the heart of one of their children? The innocent purity of the world had been brutally shattered. The grief for Lior was profound, but it was mixed with the terror of the new reality. Death was now a possibility in the hands of man himself. Aaron's act not only stole a life, but stole the peace of mind of nascent humanity, inaugurating an era of distrust. Parents looked at their children with a new fear, realizing that the eternal struggle between light and darkness was not outside, but ingrained in the very essence of humankind, an invisible and constant battle for purity of intention. Iran, the exile, abandoned the valley of Adamar, walking eastward to the land of Nod, the place of perpetual wandering. He carried with him not only the visible mark, but the open wound of conscience, a burden heavier than any harvest. His journey was the beginning of the human saga of fall and struggle, the path of a man who traded divine recognition for the fleeting satisfaction of wrath. He was the living contrast, the former, the firstborn of a partial paradise, strong and respected, and the latter, a solitary pilgrim, cursed and fugitive, whose touch rendered the earth he trod barren. His triumph, the murder of Lior, proved to be the bitterest of defeats, and the manifestation of divine justice was the preservation of his life, so that his pain might serve as a perpetual testament to the terrible cost of envy and disobedience. The legacy of the two lineages years passed, and the figure of Iran the Marked One became a whispered legend in the tents of the Adamar Valley, a cautionary tale about the voracity of pride. Far from the blessed fertility, he wandered through arid, mountainous landscapes where labor was incessant and reward meager. He bore the curse of the earth's sterility, seeing his efforts thwarted by the soil that refused his seed, a physical and relentless reminder that blessing resides in obedience and purity of heart, not brute force. Loneliness was his only companion, a cold and cutting solitude that prevented him from forgetting the shadow of Lior and the sound of the voice that had condemned him. He tried to build a new life, a new civilization, but each brick was laid upon the unstable foundation of his guilt. Iran's exile did not signify the end of his lineage, but rather the propagation of a lineage marked by deviation and the relentless search for meaning outside the divine covenant. He built the first city, not as a haven of peace, but as a defensive fortress, a monument to distrust and the fear of revenge. Instead of cultivating faith and humility, his sons learned to master the arts of war, to forge iron tools not only for work, but for aggression and protection. Evil, initiated by silent envy, evolved into structural violence. The pursuit of worth, which had consumed Iran, manifested itself in his descendants as the pursuit of power and dominion over others, distancing them ever further from the sacred traditions of the valley. The pain of losing Lior and the tragedy of the fratricide shaped the rest of Adamar's clan. Mourning gave way to a deeper, darker faith, a faith tempered by the understanding that human frailty could give rise to darkness. They clung with even greater fervor to the Creator's precepts, seeking in righteousness and communion protection against the seed of evil that had germinated among them. Lior's blood, unjustly shed, ironically became the first seedbed of spiritual vigilance and the pursuit of perfect justice. His legacy was not one of military might or grand constructions, but of the purity of intention and unconditional acceptance that the Creator had honored. He was the silent martyr of nascent humanity, whose act of pure faith eclipsed his brother's pride and exposed him in his cruelty. In the succession of ages, the contrast between the two lineages became the first metaphor for the eternal struggle. Aaron's descendants, prosperous in inventions and material dominion, were consumed by restlessness and violence. They lived in constant alert, fearing retribution and seeking to fill the emptiness of their souls with external conquests. In contrast, those who remained faithful to the traditions, though simpler and less powerful in terms of brute force, carried the legacy of Lior's peace and the blessing of divine acceptance, living a life of purpose and spiritual meaning that Iran's material wealth could never buy. Triumph lay not in the survival of the fittest or the building of the city, but in the preservation of unwavering faith and the truth that God's blessing surpasses in value any human endeavor motivated by pride. The weight of Iran's conscience was a curse more severe than exile itself. In his moments of solitude, far from the ostentation of his newly founded city, the image of his brother haunted him. He could smell the freshly turned earth and feel the warmth of flowing blood, and the echo of divine questioning pierced his nights. The pride that drove him to the act was the same pride that prevented genuine repentance. He could feel the pain and weight of guilt, but he couldn't bend the knee, preferring to live in the illusion that his new life and his creations could somehow undo the primordial crime. The drama of his soul was the battle between the irrefutable truth of his sin and the stubbornness of his will, a struggle that distanced him from the possibility of inner peace, even though divine justice had guaranteed him the protection of life. The city of Enoch, named after his son, was the material testament to Iran's alienation, a grandiose attempt to recreate an artificial paradise where stone walls would serve as substitutes for the lost covenant with the Creator. The firstborn sought in engineering and social organization the redemption that only contrition could offer. He became the tyrannical leader, the feared patriarch, whose countenance bore the harshness of the cursed land. His descendants, observing their father, learned that life was a struggle for survival, that might was the only law, and that faith was a weakness to be exploited. Iran's lineage prospered in wealth and dominion, but his soul was sick, reproducing the cycle of envy and violence on a smaller scale. If you're enjoying this story, take a second. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue with this exciting adventure, but with greater frequency, spreading the seed of malice throughout the growing world. In that same season of drought and mourning that marked the memory of Lior's loss, the Adamar clan, despite their grief, rekindled the flame of their faith. They remembered the purity of Lior's offering and the unwavering justice of the Eternal. The loss of the Righteous One became the catalyst for a more fervent dedication to righteousness and obedience. Lior's life, brief and tragically interrupted, took on the air of a silent prophecy. Genuine faith, even if humble, would always be the path to divine approval and worldly glory. Built upon pride and injustice was ephemeral. The tragedy transformed into a moral lesson, a teaching that solidified the spiritual foundation of a new people who would fight to preserve the memory of the light against the growing shadow of evil. The contrast between their destinies intensified with each passing generation. Lior's descendants, through another brother who emerged in the continuity of the alliance, lived in the simplicity of pasture land and reverence, honoring their ancestors' legacy with calm, devotion, and the absence of excessive ambition. They looked upon the city of Enoch with a mixture of revulsion and pity, seeing in those walls and the noise of that civilization the manifestation of the soul's restlessness. Divine justice was revealed not only in Iran's punishment, but also in the continuous blessing and peace granted to those who chose the path of humility and faith. The account of Iran's fall and Lior's spiritual triumph was humanity's first great epic, an ancient tale about the choice between earthly and eternal glory, sovereignty and testimony. The Eternal One had other plans for humanity, plans that transcended Iran's isolation and the clan's pain. The purpose of his justice was not the total annihilation of the sinner, but the establishment of an indelible principle, moral responsibility. The mark on Iran was not merely a reminder of the crime, but a paradoxical alliance of protection. Through him, nascent humanity learned that even evil, in its most brutal manifestation, was under the sovereignty and control of divinity, and that life, even that of the murderer, was considered sacred and could not be taken for uncontrolled vengeance. This intervention established the test of faith for future generations. Would they learn to fear evil and yet respect the Creator's greater design? Iran's saga was, therefore, the world's first catechism on limits, guilt, and sovereignty. Iran's lineage, though materially successful, carried an existential void, an insatiable thirst for power and recognition that no gold or wall could quench. Lamech, one of his descendants, amplified the malice, transforming the vengeance guaranteed to Iran into a code of extermination. If Iran will be avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 70 times 7. Human arrogance reached a new level of uncontrolled and explicit violence. The skepticism and malice that began in Iran with the silent envy of the heart had become the ideology of an entire civilization. Enoch's prosperous and noisy city was a monument to disbelief and self-sufficiency, where the memory of the sacred traditions was ridiculed or distorted to justify aggression. Meanwhile, in the simplicity of the fields and pastures, the other lineage, the one that preserved the covenant through Seth, lived in a quiet and growing devotion. They gathered to invoke the name of the Eternal with a reverence that had been forgotten in the city of Enoch. Leor's legacy, purity of intention, and selfless love flourished among them, a fragile but constant flame that contrasted with the darkness of pride. The triumph of faith manifested itself in the peace of their families, in the absence of violence among them, and in the serene expectation of a divine purpose. For them, justice was not vengeance, but the manifestation of God's character, and life was an opportunity for obedience and communion, not for domination and accumulation. Humanity's transformation was visible in 2 distinct currents, that of the marked, who advanced in inventions and violence, and that of the faithful, who advanced in wisdom and reverence. The ordeal of fratricide had forced man to choose between the path of the flesh and the path of the spirit, and the world was divided. The drama of human history was the struggle for fidelity, the attempt to reclaim the original beauty of the Valley of Adamar within hearts that now knew the weight of darkness. The Eternal One observed, allowing freedom of choice to reveal the potential for good and evil, preparing the stage for future interventions where divine justice would not only punish, but also redeem and renew the covenant with pure hearts. The prophetic legacy of Iran's act was that evil, once manifested, would not easily dissipate. Leor's murder was not an isolated event, but ground zero of a human inclination toward deviation, a fracture in morality that would be passed down as an invisible inheritance. Iran, in his old age, surrounded by the walls of his city and the clamor of his warlike descendants, was a man consumed by melancholy. He found no rest. The wealth of his house and the strength of his lineage were an empty consolation. True triumph, acceptance, and peace lay buried in the isolated plain of Adamar, beside the brother he had envied and killed. He was a king on a throne of shifting sand, aware of the inanity of his glory and the eternal weight of his error. The omnipresent narrator reveals the antagonist's deepest motivation. Hiran's malice, initially a quest for worth, transformed into a mechanism of denial. He invested all his energy in building a world where he didn't need the Creator, where approval came from men and brute force. His skepticism was a defense against the pain of initial rejection, a refusal to accept that the goodness of the heart was worth more than the sweat of the brow. He was the personification of human failure, the man who could have been blessed by obedience, but who chose condemnation. Through pride, becoming the architect of his own misfortune and the sower of discord among generations. The absence of genuine repentance was his own personal hell, built brick by brick with the stubbornness of his soul. For Iran, redemption never came in the form of the revocation of his mark or a return to the Valley of Adamar. The triumph of divine justice was to compel the sinner to live with the fruit of his choice. He had to witness the rise of a violent world, knowing that the seed of that violence had been planted by his own hands. He saw the vivid contrast between the perpetual unrest of his city and the serene peace of the faithful families who still invoked the name of the Eternal. His legacy was a lesson in reverse morality. The path of pride leads to ruin, even when shrouded in material achievements. The great turning point of destiny, guided by the higher will, was to ensure that crime did not destroy hope, but served as an eternal counterpoint to faithfulness. In those ancient times, the tale of Leor's trial and triumph, the triumph of his accepted faith over his brother's pride was told in the dark nights, under the stars. The divine purpose was not merely the punishment of the guilty, but the exaltation of virtue. The cry of Lior's blood became a teaching voice, a prophecy that the righteous would be honored, and evil, even if it prospered for a time, would be marked and isolated. God's justice manifested itself as the unbreakable covenant, with pure intent, and the triumph, the inevitable victory of faith over force, of grace over pride. The saga of Iran and Lior was the inaugural epic of redemption, where evil was contained and the hope of a return to harmony was preserved for the faithful. The fulfillment of the prophecy of transformation. The spiritual transformation of the Adamar Valley, following Iran's exile, was a slow but steady consolidation of the community of the faithful, those who were willing to learn from suffering. They understood that the trial was not the suffering itself, but the reaction to it. The clan, under the leadership of the wisest, instituted more rigorous rituals of introspection and judgment of intentions, seeking to eradicate the seeds of pride and envy before they could germinate. Leah's memory was celebrated not with endless lamentations, but with acts of selfless kindness and offerings made in a spirit of humility. They became the guardians of purity, the keepers of the primordial covenant, understanding that true strength resided in the vulnerability of faith and the willingness to obey. In that new season, the clan witnessed the emergence of righteous men, such as Enos, who began to invoke the name of the Eternal in a new way, with renewed fervor and awareness of the distance that sin had created. This revelation of divine purpose was a direct reaction to the fall of Iran. The people understood that justice was not merely retribution, but the path to restoration. Faith deepened, transforming from a received tradition into a conscious and painful choice. Life in the fields, which for Iran was merely work, became for the faithful an act of worship, where sweat and harvest were expressions of gratitude and dependence, a vivid contrast to the proud self-sufficiency of the city of Enoch. Iran's fate, though cruel, was an inevitable fulfillment of the promise that every action carries its weight. He had sought recognition by all means and obtained it as the first. Murderer, the founder of violence. His material triumph was his greatest moral failure. The contrast with Lior was eloquent. The shepherd, killed in his innocence, was remembered as a model of devotion, an unbreakable link to original purity. The farmer, alive and prosperous, was a specter of guilt, a symbol of what happens when man tries to bargain with the Creator, offering heartless effort. The drama reached its climax in each generation, in the constant struggle not to reproduce the error of the firstborn and to honor the simplicity of the youngest. Aaron's story was told with solemnity and indignation, for the injustice of his choice and the violence of his act were repulsive. But the account always ended with the satisfaction of the victory of faith, as the community was strengthened in the certainty of divine justice and the continuing covenant. The Creator's faithfulness manifested itself in the protection of the righteous and in the imposition of limits on evil, symbolized by the mark of Iran. The clan understood that the ordeal had been a catalyst for their own transformation, forcing them to evolve from a naive people to a vigilant and spiritually mature people. The triumph, therefore, was not the downfall of the villain, but the rise of pure devotion amidst the shadow of human wickedness. In the long years of those early days, Iran, already bowed down not by years, but by unresolved guilt, watched his own descendants plunge into a spiral of chaos. He saw aggression become the norm, and justice a concept manipulable by force. The shock of the reality of his upbringing was constant. The city he had built for his protection had revealed itself to be a nest of vipers, where distrust and malice multiplied. He, who had feared the vengeance of others, had created an environment where violence was self-generated. His pain deepened as he realized that the mark on his forehead did not protect him from the pain of conscience, nor from the fate of his lineage, which was drifting further and further away from the light of the Alliance. The contrast between before and after in Iran's life was the essence of the drama. The man who, in the valley of Adamar, worked the land with vigor and faith, albeit proud faith, was now a ghost in his own city, a patriarch without peace. He had traded the discreet and lasting approval of the Eternal for the clamor and fleeting recognition of equally misguided men. The skepticism he had planted in his heart blossomed into cold despair. He, the man of strength, felt himself the weakest of all, unable to control the consequences of his own actions. He visualized Lior's serenity, and compared it to his own gilded misery, understanding too late that true triumph is peace of mind and true weakness, the inability to love what is pure. On the other side of humanity, the prophecy of transformation was being fulfilled. The faithful, living under the shadow of tragedy, refined the art of coexistence and submission. Enoch, from the lineage of Seth, walked with the Creator in such closeness of heart and purpose that the Eternal One took him to himself, a living and eloquent testimony that fidelity and purity of intention were still the path to perfect communion. This event caused reverence and reinforced the covenant. The Creator had not abandoned humanity, but had only separated the wheat from the chaff, honoring faith above all conquests and showing that the ultimate triumph is not against the enemy, but in the victory over one's own carnal nature. The epic of Iran and Leor concluded with the perpetuation of a principle: individual choice defines legacy. The narrative, though bathed in sadness for the loss of original innocence, elevated the moral of the story, ensuring that the reader felt the majesty of divine intervention. Divine justice was not only punitive, but also educational, preserving the life of the murderer so that he might serve as a living witness to the cost of sin, and exalting the memory of the righteous so that he might be the eternal model of faith and obedience. The story was a solemn invitation to delve into introspection, forcing each individual to confront the Iran within themselves and to seek the simplicity and purity of Leor. The Creator, in his inscrutable wisdom, allowed Iran's descendants to prosper in material possessions so that the contrast would become even more vivid and the lesson more impactful. The opulence of Enoch's city and the sophistication of its inventions, amidst spiritual poverty and incessant violence, were conclusive proof that true blessing does not reside in the mastery of matter, but in the peace of the spirit. The skepticism and malice that became the ideology of his clan were the inevitable result of denying the Creator, a self-destruction disguised as progress. Iran, at the end of his days, was the loneliest of men, isolated not by walls or exile, but by the insurmountable barrier of his unconfessed guilt and unbroken pride. In that atmosphere of continuous trial for the world, the covenant and divine protection manifested themselves upon the righteous with renewed clarity. The Eternal One cared for the descendants of Seth and those who had chosen the path of reverence, spiritually isolating them from the corruption emanating from the city of Iran. They lived in a state of vigilance and constant pursuit of holiness, understanding that closeness to God was the only safe refuge in the growing darkness. Leor's sacrifice was the first example that faith demands a price, but that this price is always honored by higher justice. Their lives were a continuous worship, the silent and persistent response to the chaos introduced by fratricide. Leor's triumph and that of his faith lay not in resisting aggression, but in the purity of his surrender, which the Creator accepted. He was the first victim, but also the first hero of faith, whose story taught that true victory does not reside in conquering others, but in pleasing God. His memory evoked indignation at Iran's vile act, but also profound satisfaction in the certainty that his spirit was with the source of life. The account was a chronicle of potential redemption, showing that, although evil had entered, the path to restoration and communion remained open to those who chose humility and obedience over pride and deviation. Iran, the decrepit patriarch, would die as he lived, isolated in his illusory glory and a prisoner of his own conscience. There was no triumphant return nor public repentance for him. Divine justice was complete, ensuring that he carried the weight of his choice until his last breath. The shock and regret he felt were not for the offense against the Creator, but for the ruin of his own destiny, which denied him final solace. His death was an event without the solemnity of genuine mourning, but with the tacit relief of a world that saw the end of a symbol of malice. The legacy he left was the seed of violence and skepticism, the opposite of the legacy of faith and purity that Leor in his death had immortalized. The final contrast was striking. The city of Enoch, noisy and powerful, but condemned to unrest. The valley of Adamar and its surroundings, simple and serene, but blessed by peace and the divine presence. The narrative fulfilled its purpose of instilling reverence for the Creator and elevating the moral of the story. Man can choose to stray and build his own personal hell, but divine justice ensures that the path of faithfulness is honored and preserved. The transformation of humanity was visible in the growing separation between the two lineages, one heading towards perdition in vanity, and the other advancing towards redemption in humility and obedience. The epic of Iran and Leor was not merely a tale of the past, but a map for the future. Iran's act had introduced the concept of darkness into the heart, but Leor's sacrifice and the subsequent faithfulness of the other lineage introduced the concept of redemption and spiritual resilience. The Creator, by marking Iran and granting his life, ensured that the living proof of evil existed as an eternal memento mori. But by honoring Leor and raising Enos, he ensured that hope and the path of the covenant remained accessible and glorified. Life became for the righteous a constant test of faith, an opportunity to reverse the curse of fratricide through acts of love and devotion. Thus, the saga of Iran and Leor remained etched in the memory of generations. It was not merely a story of brothers, but an allegory of the human heart itself, where the valley of Adamar became the stage for the struggle between pride and humility, between malice and selfless kindness. The Creator had permitted the tragedy so that humanity might understand the inestimable value of freedom of choice and the solemnity of its consequences. Leor's life was the covenant of hope, Iran's mark, the seal of warning. The ultimate purpose was inspiration, the connection to the reality that spiritual transformation is the only path to true triumph. Iran, the firstborn, lay in his tomb in the city he had founded, and the weight of history rested upon it. But Leor, the murdered shepherd, lived eternally in the spirit and unwavering faith of his descendants, those who, looking to heaven and invoking the name of the Eternal, kept alive the fragile yet indestructible flame of the covenant. Divine justice had manifested itself. Evil was contained, the lesson was learned, and the promise of redemption, however late and painful, awaited hearts willing to abandon the path of envy and pride. The world, marked by blood, moved forward under the constant vigilance of the Creator and the hope of restored faithfulness. Do you want more Bible stories filled with faith, teachings, and heartwarming moments? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow us with each new story.